Hey guys, Ruckus Gaming here, coming at you with another episode of Tuesday Tips and Tricks. Today we're going to be talking about silent uncommon cards with our tier list. As I always say, this is really just a measurement for me about how often and in how many different varieties of decks a card can be useful. But based on some of the reactions I've seen, I think I will start to make a little bit more of an allowance for some very powerful key cards that may not necessarily work in all decks, but are very important to the success of the decks they do fit in. So, without further ado, let's just jump straight into it. First up, we have Accuracy. This will grant shivs 4 more damage or upgrade to 6 more damage. And we're going to plop that right into a tier. Now, obviously, this is one of those cards that doesn't necessarily work in all decks. This is not going to do a lot for you in a poison deck, but it is something that I do think is completely necessary if you are running any kind of shiv deck. The simple fact is that shivs are so weak on their own that by the time you get to the end of Act 3, if you don't have any way to scale those shivs up, you're going to be hurting. So you need to make them hit a little bit harder, and this is one of the best ways to do that. Next up, we have All Out Attack. This will deal 10 damage to all enemies, upgrades to 14. And if you play this card, you will have to discard a random card. And with the upgrade, you don't get to choose it like you would with a True Grit, for example. So I'm going to throw this in B tier. I really do like the AoE. I think that's a really good thing for the Silent to have. But just because of the discard mechanic, you can run into some weird situations where you probably don't want to play this, or you have to be very careful about how you play it because it may discard something that you really want. So you have to balance the order of the play, the energy you've got. It can be a little tricky, but I think it is worth it most of the time just because AoE damage is so nice to have for the Silent. Next up, we have Backstab. This is an innate card that will do 11 damage and upgrades to 15 damage and will then exhaust once it is played. I gotta be honest, I don't take Backstab a lot. I think it is really nice early damage if you can get it in Act 1, where the Silent is a little slow on damage. But at the end of the day, I also don't think it's really a huge factor in a lot of things, especially once you get higher up the Spire. 10 to 15 damage on an Act 3 Elite is nice, but I mean, it's not gonna win the run for you. It can scale up with something like Wrist Blade because it is 0 cost, which is nice. But very average card, so I'm just gonna throw this right in B tier as well. Next up, we have Blur. This will give you 5 block, but it also gives you a buff so that your block will not be removed at the end of this turn. I absolutely love Blur. This is one of my favorite Silent cards, and I'm throwing it into top of A tier for now. With the amount of block that Silent is often able to generate, it's really nice to be able to hang onto it. I also do like the small block because of Wraith form and how often you are encouraged to take something like Apparitions on the Silent. I think you might take Apparitions more on her than some other characters. So having small block is all you really need. You don't need to have lots of block, but having small block from turn to turn with Wraith form or Apparitions is really nice. Or if you just have a deck that is creating lots of excess block. If you play this multiple times, if you can get a burst on this, you will extend that buff so that you can keep your buff longer. And it's essentially kind of like Silent's baby barricade. Next up is Bouncing Flask. This poison skill will add 3 poison to a random enemy 3 times, and it upgrades to 3 poison up to 4 times. This is one of my favorite poison cards that isn't Corpse Explosion. It looks like AoE damage, but what it really is single target damage. You don't really want to be spreading out the poison, probably. You would rather it focus all on one. And when you can get down to one enemy, or you just have a single enemy combat, it's absolutely amazing. Gets a lot of poison out really quickly, which is where those poison decks can sometimes struggle. If you're not getting your poison up quickly enough, if you're not building it up, if you're not keeping it up, that's really tough. So Bouncing Flask is a great way to balance it out. You can dump all that poison onto one enemy, or perhaps spread it among multiple, though of course one is preferable. Next up, we have Calculated Gamble. This will allow you to discard your hand and then draw that many. Unupgraded, it will exhaust, but if you upgrade it, it will not. And this is our first S tier card. Another one of my absolute favorites. I love Calculated Gamble. It pairs so nicely with so many of the silent discard relics, such as Tough Bandages or Tingsha. It's great for clearing out status cards or curses, and it is a fixture in just about any kind of silent deck. She loves to discard, she loves to keep drawing, and this is one of the best ways she has to do that. Our next silent uncommon is Caltrops. Whenever you take damage, deal 3 damage back. Upgrades to 5 damage back. I have always wanted this to do more. It's not a very exciting card. It can offer quite good value, especially in the later part of a run. There are a lot of enemies that multi-attack. Donu Deka, Time Eater, Shield and Spear, the Heart. A lot of the toughest enemies in this game multi-attack. So you do like having something to mitigate or at least counter that. One Caltrops all by itself is 2 is actually pretty good, but it can also just be a little awkward to play. Sometimes there are just other things that are more important, and unless you've got energy to spare, Caltrops might be one of those things that just doesn't get played, unfortunately. So this is gonna be the absolute bottom B tier card for me. It's not a bad card by any means, but it can be a little bit hard to work in, and unless you have multiple copies, the payback is often a little underwhelming, though it can be quite good. Our next uncommon silent card is Catalyst. Double the enemy's poison and exhaust. Upgrade to triple the enemy's poison, and this is just the absolute top of S tier for silent uncommons. Now obviously this is not going to work in decks that don't use poison, and I know I said that I tend to rank cards highly based on how varied their uses can be and how many different paths they have to success, but the simple fact is that Catalyst is just a game-winning card, a run-winning card, as long as you're running a poison deck. You would love to have more than one. It can be combined with Nightmare or Burst to just end combats almost instantly. If you can get 20 poison and then you can play 2 Catalysts, that will just about take care of everything. Next up, we have the uncommon attack Choke. Deal 12 damage, and then for every card played, you will deal 3 HP to that enemy, upgraded to 5 HP damage. Choke is going to be a C tier card for me. I think obviously this only really works in decks that play lots of cards. This could be a nice complement to a Shiv deck, for example. It only works on single targets. This is not going to function like 1,000 Cuts, which does AoE damage, which is probably the main benefit of 1,000 Cuts, but Choke is still okay. It does have kind of a narrow path to being useful, and being 2 cost, again, it is something that you may run into situations where you just have other things you want to play more. And if you don't have the artifact charges off yet of the enemy, you know, Choke is not going to have its added effect. You could use it to remove the Choke or the artifact charge, but most of the time, I think there are probably better ways to spend your energy unless you are running a very particular style of deck. Next up is Concentrate. This will allow you to discard 3 cards and gain 2 energy. Upgraded, you only need to discard 2 cards. I'm going to throw this into C tier as well. It is a really good card. The only problem is that you kind of need a lot of other pieces first. You need to be able to draw and build up big hands so that you have extra cards to discard, and you still have cards to play. A lot of times if you see this in Act 1, if you snap it up, you're going to run into a lot of cases where you have 3 cards left, and one of them is Concentrate, so you can discard everything and you can get 2 energy and you can't do anything with it. You're going to need a lot of things to support this, and it can be a really good late take, but if you're not running that kind of deck, then it's just kind of worthless. Next up, we have Crippling Cloud. Apply 4 poison and 2 weak. This is going to be near the bottom of A tier for me. I do like this card for applying poison and weak. It's great for getting rid of artifact charges if they are there. Also good for helping you stay alive a little bit longer. Those weak debuffs are a great way to prevent incoming damage. This is probably something you wouldn't take if you weren't already going poison, but I think this can even be a decent way to start a poison deck. If you're only a couple floors in and you see a Crippling Cloud, I'd snap that up, no problem. I would not say this is, you know, an accuracy where you would never want to take that before you have some shivs in your hand. I think you can take a Crippling Cloud first and just use that as your branch down the poison tree. Taking an accuracy and hoping for shivs is a little risky. Next up is Dash. Deal 10 damage and get 10 block for 2 energy. I'm going to throw this at the top middle of A tier. I really like this attack a lot. I love seeing this early in a run, obviously. I think it's great. Even at 2 cost early in a run, it gives you a decent amount of block as well as doing damage. It's going to work really well if you can get a Necronomicon. I absolutely love Dash with Necronomicon. It's not a sexy card. It's not gonna win the run, but I do think it is very strong, very functional, and you can pick this up, I would say, anywhere from Act 1 to even perhaps late Act 2 and get good use out of it. Next up, we have the uncommon skill Distraction. Add a random skill to your hand and it costs 0. If you upgrade it, this will also cost 0. I think this is a D tier card for me, unless you have some kind of exhaust synergy going on with Dead Branch. Silent doesn't really care about exhaust that much. It's a free common skill, which could be useful or could just be garbage. I just don't like the randomness of it. I feel like in roguelikes, you are trying to reduce the amount of RNG in any given turn or any given combat or room or whatever it is. And so items or cards or weapons, skills, anything like that that introduces more RNG is generally not going to be that helpful. So if this was a ironclad card, you might rank it a little bit more highly, but being on the silent, I just don't love it that much. Next up is Endless Agony. This 0 cost attack will deal 4 damage, upgrades to 6 damage, and it has the interesting and perhaps only in the game effect of cloning itself and adding a copy to your hand when it is drawn. So you could choose to either play both and exhaust them to get out of your deck, or you could keep one and redraw it and continue to create more Endless Agony cards later. For me, this is a C tier card. It does scale with Wrist Blade, which is nice, but it doesn't work with accuracy. And again, as I have said, the silent doesn't really care about exhaust unless you've got Dead Branch. It's not a significant amount of damage. I don't know what a deck built around Endless Agony would even really look like, because no one really builds around it. It is a nice little support piece. It can be a little bit of extra damage. If you have relics that rely on playing attacks, such as Kunai or Shuriken, or even just playing cards like Ink Bottle, it can work nicely with that. Drawing cards, playing cards, etc. But the flat damage of it, the lack of real physical scaling that Silent really suffers from as far as just attacking physically, this is not a card that I rely on very often. Next up is Escape Plan. This is a 0 cost skill that will draw a card, and if that card is a skill, it will give you some block. 3 block or up to 5 upgraded. I'm going to throw this at the top of B tier. I'm a pretty big Escape Plan fan. The Silent does have a lot of skills that she really wants to build up her deck with. I haven't gone through and counted, but it feels like she has more skills than attacks. Maybe that's wrong, but it certainly feels that way, especially with how often you are going to be playing some of those skills. You always want to be playing backflips. You always want to be playing acrobatics or blade dances or whatever. So you like playing her skills. You want to be drawing lots of skills. As I've already said, I like small block because of Wraith Form and Apparitions. And while it's not a super sexy card, it's not going to win the game for you. It can be a really nice support piece, and it can work really well in some certain kinds of decks. The deck cycle, draw and discard style of decks really do like an escape plan in them. Next up, we have Eviscerate. This card will start at 3 energy, but then it will reduce its cost based on how many cards you can discard this turn. It will do 7 damage 3 times or upgrade to 9 damage 3 times. This is a top tier, C tier attack. I love that it can get cheaper instead of getting more expensive, like a card we're going to talk about later. So it can get better over time. It leans into the discard mechanic that the Silent loves so much, and it is pretty decent damage. If you can get a little bit of strength on it, it's even better, though obviously that might be a challenge for you on the Silent. My main thing is that it does require a healthy amount of discard to be reliably useful. So many of the silent decks are going to have a little bit of discard, but I don't think every silent deck is going to have the amount of discard that Eviscerate really wants. That being said, if you do have the discard to do it, you should definitely pick this up. It's a really good card if you've got what you need to make it work. Our next uncommon skill is Expertise. Draw until you have 6 cards in your hand. Upgrade to 7 cards. I'm going to put this right next to Concentrate for basically the same reason. Is just that you need to have a lot of support in your deck to really make this work. You need to be able to have the energy to play a couple cards, get under 6 cards in your hand, then also play this, and also still have more energy to draw those cards. There's a lot of ifs in that scenario, which when you're playing a roguelike, more ifs means more RNG, more unreliability, harder to win. You want to be reducing RNG, you want to be reducing those ifs, you want to have cards that just always put out great value easily, and this just is asking for a little too much, both of them. Next up we have Finisher. This uncommon attack will deal 6 damage for each attack you have played this turn, and it upgrades to 8 damage per attack. I am going to put this into B tier. Obviously, this really just depends on how many attacks you can play per turn. If you have lots of shivs, if you have lots of energy and draw, this can be your finisher. There's no other way to say it. This can be a great way to deal lots of damage really quickly and end those nasty combats where you might be looking at a huge HP pool at the end of Act 3. And this will just melt them if you can get a big turn going. Of course, it kind of relies on you playing lots of attacks and relying on physical damage. If you're going a poison route, this is probably not going to be very useful. Next up we have Flechettes. This will deal 4 damage for each skill in your hand, or upgrade to 6 damage for each skill in your hand. I'm going to drop this right next to Finisher for about the same reasons. It's a little bit worse because it is not, how many skills did you play, but how many skills do you currently have. That means there is an upper limit to this card. Perhaps you have 9 skills in your hand. That's you've maxed out the damage this card can do. There is no necessary upper limit on Finisher. If you can get an infinite deck, all you have to do is hold on to Finisher, keep drawing that Shivs card you've been playing over and over, get that energy back with, Sundial, something like that. And you could ostensibly get a turn large enough and play enough Shivs to just have Finisher end it all. Doesn't work like that for Flechettes, unfortunately. So a little bit lower, but pretty much the same reasoning for where it's at. Silent does have plenty of skills. She relies on her skills. So it is reasonable to believe that this could be useful in a wide number of decks, but it would be marginally useful. So it can complement a poison deck pretty nicely. It can complement a draw, discard, cycle deck pretty nicely. But it's never going to be like the focal point of either of those kinds of decks. Throwing this into a poison deck is not going to, elevate that poison deck to the next level like a Catalyst would. So middle card situationally can be quite useful. Next up we have the Silent Power Footwork. This will give you 2 dexterity or 3 upgraded. And I'm going to throw that in S tier, right above Calculated Gamble. The silent playstyle is just the exact opposite of the Ironclad playstyle. Instead of doing big damage and killing fast, she very much likes to kind of sit back and outlast enemies whittle them down little by little, or wait until she has the setup for the perfect killing blow. If that is the kind of class fantasy or play style core mechanic that you are working with, then anything that increases your ability to block, to stall combats, to make them last longer is going to be just super useful. Next up, we have the uncommon attack Heel Hook. Deal 5 damage, and conditionally, if the enemy has weak, you can gain energy and draw a card. The upgrade is just, I think, 7 damage, so it doesn't really add a lot to it. That can be a positive for Heel Hook. It is also a common ingredient to a very, very simple infinite. If you can get weak, if you can get 2 heel hooks, and you can get a deck that fits into one hand, then you have a very simple silent infinite. Unfortunately, I've tried that and it just never really seems to work out for me. The heel hook feels like it should be better, and maybe I'm just using it wrong. But I always feel like I take this with high hopes and expectations. It has a lot of things that I like. Having energy, having draw is really good, but it just kind of underperforms for me. C tier. Next up, we have Infinite Blades. At the start of your turn, add a shiv to your hand. The upgrade is just to make it innate, so that it will start in your hand every combat. And I gotta say, this is a D tier silent card. It is just too slow. It doesn't do anything on the turn that you play it, and all it gives you is a single shiv. Upgrading it does not really improve it in any meaningful way. This is not something that I feel like I am desperate to have on the first turn of a combat. Yes, that will maximize the value that it provides, but even maximizing that small amount of value is just not like a lot, even in a Shiv's deck. So for me, this is usually just a pass. D tier. Next up, we have Leg Sweep. Apply 2 weak and gain 11 block, or if you upgrade it, 3 weak and 14 block, I believe. I'm going to throw this right at the top of A tier. I absolutely love this card. It is one of my favorite block cards for the Silent. It is a juicy amount of block, and then adding the weak is the icing on the cake on top of it. Increasing that weak with an upgrade is so nice. I will pretty much take this in any kind of Silent deck that I have. I don't think there's any reason not to. It's not an S tier card. It's not gonna like win the game for you, but it's just super, super solid function. Next up is Masterful Stab. This card will start at 0 energy, and then each time you take damage, it will increase its cost by 1 energy. It will start off at 12 damage, and you can upgrade it to 16. But I am throwing this at the bottom of C tier. I do not like that it gets more expensive. You can run into combats where you just don't get good draw, you take unavoidable damage, and then this becomes a brick. Once this gets up to even just 3, maybe even 2, I don't even know if this is worth 2. Might be worth 2, I don't know, it's kind of tough. So with that in mind, unless you have a super, super strong blocking deck, maybe you've got Wraith Form or Apparitions, maybe you can just cycle endlessly, but either way, I just feel like most of the time you're going to be taking damage, and this is just going to get worse over the course of every combat. So with that in mind, C tier. Next up, we have Noxious Fumes. At the start of your turn, apply 2 poison to all enemies, or if you upgrade it, up to 3 poison for all enemies. I'm going to plop this at the top of B tier, right next to Escape Plan. Obviously, if you're not running a poison deck, this is not going to do much for you, but when you are running a poison deck, this is great for making sure that you're not losing any of that poison, especially early in a run. Maybe you've got like 1 poison stab, maybe you've got like 1 deadly poison, and if you get like a bad reshuffle, you know, you get your poison stab turn 1 and then you draw all the way through, you reshuffle, you don't get your poison stab until the last hand of the next reshuffle, you may end up running out of poison, and you kind of need that for a poison deck to work. So Noxious Fumes is going to offer a lot of just simple value in that your poison is always going up, and it is AoE. It's doing it to everybody. It's a great way to get rid of artifact charges, and it's just kind of a little bit of insurance. You can rest assured that even if you are forced to spend an entire turn blocking, you will still be adding to that poison and getting closer to your win condition on every turn. Next up is the Uncommon Attack Predator. Deal 15 damage for 2 costs and draw 2 cards next turn. This upgrades to 20 damage, and this is one of my absolute favorite silent attacks. This is going at the top of A tier. Not quite powerful enough to be a run-defining or centerpiece of a deck kind of card, but just super, super valuable. I think the Silent struggles to get big, chunky damage, and this solves that. It's 2 costs, so it works with Necronomicon. I think that's always worth keeping your mind on, you know, right in the back of your mind somewhere. If you are collecting 2 or 3 2-cost cards that are attacks, you should be kind of thinking about Necronomicon already, because doubling anything in this game, when it says double or when it says triple, that's really, really powerful. Being able to play a card twice is super, super good. So 2-cost cards, especially attacks, should always be triggering Necronomicon in the back of your mind. Even the fact that you're not drawing these 2 cards now and you're going to wait until next turn to draw them, that is fine. You're playing a 2 energy attack now. You're not going to have the energy for 2 extra cards right now, probably, especially early in a run. So you know what? That's fine. That's great. Play it, do a big chunky attack. Next turn, draw more cards. Decide how you want to use next turn's energy to the best of your ability. Absolutely amazing card. Love Predator. Next up, we have the Uncommon Skill Reflex. This is one of Silent's unplayable cards. If you discard, you will draw 2 cards. Upgrade to drawing 3 cards. I'm going to put this near the top of B tier. Obviously, this requires you to have some form of discard in your deck. I think most, if not all, Silent decks will have some discard. I mean, you start with Survivor in your starter deck, so it's going to be there. The question is whether or not you're going to be able to easily line up drawing Reflex with one of those discard cards. If you are running a very heavy draw engine with Backflip, well, you're not going to have a lot of discard. If you've got Acrobatics, if you've got Prepared, then it becomes really interesting. And if you've got a Calculated Gamble, even better. But also, I wouldn't say by itself or in simple combination with something like, you know, Acrobatics. It's not game breaking until you get his little friend, who we'll get to in just a minute. Next up, we have Riddled with Holes. You do 3 damage 5 times. Upgrade to 4 damage 5 times for 2 cost. I know I just did a whole spiel about 2 cost cards and chonky damage on the Silent not being a thing, but Riddled with Holes is bad. This is a bottom C tier card for me. And the real reason is the simple fact that Silent does not have a lot of strength scaling. Unless you got really lucky and you got a Shuriken, maybe you got a Girya, maybe you got a Vajra, it's going to tap out at 15 to 20 damage for 2 cost. And that's it. 20 damage, 2 cost. That's the same as upgraded Predator without any extra draw. So you can think about this like Predator minus the draw. And the draw is arguably much more important than just the damage on Predator, so it's missing the most important thing. If this were an Ironclad card where you had access to lots of strength scaling quite easily, this would be amazing. But this is the Silent, so it's trash. Next up, we have Setup. Put a card on top of your draw pile, and it costs 0 until played. This card can lead to some absolutely silly things. If you can get set up and you can get whatever your win condition is, whether it is Catalyst or Wraith form or whatever you're going for here. If you get a 0 cost card, you copy it with a Nightmare, you can do all kinds of crazy things with this. But it kind of relies on having the perfect draw order. Do you have the Nightmare in hand? Do you have the Setup also in hand? Do you also have the card that you want to make 0 cost and multiple copies of yada yada? Like if you can make this better with Retain. If you have a Runic Pyramid, this suddenly becomes much more viable. But otherwise, you are really hoping to draw like 3 cards at once. Otherwise, you're running into situations where, you can maybe play this and you can draw the next card, but it's not going to actually do a lot unless you get the really niche setup. If you've got lots of expensive cards, it might be better, but there's not a lot of expensive cards in the Silent card pool, if we're being honest. Wraith form is expensive. Some 2 cost attacks. Bullet time is expensive. But there's not a lot that you need to be 0 cost that can also be game breaking and will also be something that is so powerful that you must be able to play it to win. All of this adds up to just too many ifs for me, so I'm putting Setup as the absolute worst, bottom of D tier Silent card. Next up, we have Skewer. Very simple X cost card. Deal 7 damage 3 times. Upgrades to 9 damage 3 times. I'm going to put this in B tier right along with Finisher and Flechettes for basically the same reasons. This can be a really big, chunky attack. If you've got multiple energy, this is great with Necronomicon. Silent doesn't have the best physical scaling, so you are often not really concerned with physical damage that much. You've got your poisons, but otherwise, it's just decent. It's fine. If you can create lots of excess energy, it's really nice. But I don't think that the Silent has the same kind of tools for creating exorbitant amounts of excess energy at once. You can chain things together to create infinite or near infinite amounts of small energy consistently, but it is not like playing as the defect where you can just create plasma and then double energy and suddenly you have 15 energy. It's just a little bit hard to get a lot out of it, but it's all right. If you get it early, it can get you through Act 1 maybe, and then you can pivot to something else. It's a fine card. It's not bad. It's not great. It's all right. Next up, we have Tactician, the second unplayable silent card. This will give you 1 energy if you can discard it, upgraded to 2 energy if you can discard it. I'm going to put this kind of at the end of A tier with these other functional cards like Accuracy or Bouncing Flask. This is an absolute great way to go infinite. If you can get Tactician plus Reflex together, and maybe you got some Prepareds, maybe you've got an Acrobatics, you are cooking with gas. I think any silent deck, no matter what, is going to have enough discard to make this worth it because it's energy. And I think that's quite a bit more valuable than just a little bit more draw. Obviously, you'd like to have energy and draw, but if you give me a Tactician next to a Reflex, all things considered, even across the board, I'm taking the Tactician. Energy is just that much more important. Next up, we have Terror. This 1-cost card will apply 99 vulnerable and then exhaust, and it upgrades to 0 cost. Maybe this is just me, but I absolutely love Terror, and I'm going to throw this in S tier. Maybe that's wrong, but I absolutely love this card. Even though the silent is not necessarily super physically damage focused, I still think this is a great way to boost the damage she already does. And this can be useful even in a deck that is not super physical focused. I think you could put this in a poison deck just fine. And it would still be very useful because even if you're running a poison deck, you're still going to have attacks in that deck. It's not going to be 100% skills getting you through, Act 1. Terror is a great way to take the somewhat low starting damage that the silent has and make it quite decent. And if you're running a Shivs deck, even better. And finally, we will close out with Well-Laid Plans. At the end of your turn, retain 1 card, upgrade to retain 2 cards. I'm going to throw this near the top, just next to Catalyst, S tier card. I am literally always taking this, unless it is up against something that I absolutely must have to make my deck function. If it's just 3 cards and they're all equally useful, this is gonna trump everything else. Well-Laid Plans allows you to hold on to your best cards and play them in the exact moment you need them. Having the right card at the right time is the #1 challenge of Slay the Spire, in my opinion, and this goes a very long way to fixing that. It's interesting that I think this has some benefits over something like Runic Pyramid. Obviously, only being able to keep 2 cards, if you've got more than that you want to keep, is kind of a bummer, but to be honest, most of the time you don't really want to keep your whole hand. There's quite often cards that you don't want to keep. There might be curses or status cards or even basic strikes and defends that will clog up your hand and keep you from drawing. So in that regard, Well-Laid Plans is even better than a boss relic because you can keep the 2 best cards in your hand, the 2 most important. You can plan ahead. If you know you've got some nasty damage coming in, you can save that Wraith form. You can save your big block cards. You can get your nightmare prepared, and you can wait for the perfect turn so that you can play the nightmare on that wraith form, or you can nightmare those apparitions. Like, there are so many synergistic combinations of cards that the Silent relies on, and having them at the proper time and well-laid plans is the absolute best way to make sure that those things happen. So that is it for the Silent Uncommon tier list. Please let me know if you have any thoughts. I am the first to admit that I am not the best Silent player in the world. She is easily my weakest character, so if you feel like I am completely misunderstanding or misusing or just not getting why some card is better than I've ranked it, please let me know. I'm always looking to improve, so please drop your comment, like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. And as always, have a great day. Thanks for watching Ruckus Gaming.